Okay, let's finish up with chapter 12. Last time we let off with the sad case of Kitty. I wanted to show you some images. Here's a picture I took at the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C. just the other day, August of 2002. Some other pictures I took. This is, I believe, from the Henry Ford Museum. Another one. Early banner. Here's some actual water fountains that were used back in the day, which indicated which ones you could use, or if you're waiting in a waiting room, which room you could actually wait in. And I told my family to wait in that waiting room since they were colored. Anytime anybody uses that expression, the person was colored, I ask them, what color? You know, because there's a lot of shades. This one I also took just the other day. This is a rally in Ann Arbor, Michigan, fighting against the Nazis and the KKK. And it looked like it could have been taken maybe a month or two ago, but in actuality, it was taken March 20th, 1982. So that leads me to my discussion, prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice, of course, is just an attitude. It's usually based on limited information, it's based on stereotypes. We all have prejudices about people, food, places, music. I often hear from my students, I like every type of music except for country. Well, I would suspect that that might be true for that individual, but they haven't heard all types of country music, right? Discrimination is when you take those attitudes and actually take action. In other words, you may not like a particular group of individuals. That's just an attitude. That's just a prejudicial attitude. But when you refuse to serve them at a restaurant, when you refuse to hire them at a place of employment based on the color of their skin, their gender, um, their religion, their age, that's discrimination. So, where do we get these stereotypes from? Well, a lot of places. What are Indians like? Well, when you hear Indians, you might think of folks from Mumbai, or you might think of people like yourselves with Native American indigenous blood. My notion of Indians, so-called Indians, was what I was growing up as part of my culture, but also what I saw on television, cowboys and Indians, right? And of course, we know that's a very limited picture of reality. When I say Canadians, what are Canadians like? If I ask you specifically, what sport are Canadians into? First thing you might say is, well, they're into hockey, right? So if we think of Canadians, our impression of Canadians might include things like hockey, but might broaden a little bit, just like if somebody were to say Americans. Americans are so diverse, right? What happens with stereotypes is we get them pretty early in our life. And what happens is we kind of confirm the stereotype that we may have by experiences we might have. Those people are like this way. And when we meet people that fit that definition, it just confirms what we believe. So we maintain them. And we surround people that have similar ideas, right? Now, can we overcome our stereotypes? Because we know that stereotypes are very limiting. They could lead to discrimination unnecessarily. And many of you have experienced discrimination based on your culture, your age. Yes, we can overcome these things. There's a story of a fella who was playing in a band. He happened to be African American, and a guy came up to him and said, "Man, how did you learn how to play that so well?" And He says, you play just like, and he mentioned some popular artist who happened to be Caucasian. And the musician said, well, who do you think taught that fellow? It was black people that taught that fellow. Well, the individual who made conversation with this African-American musician happened to be a member of the Ku Klux Klan. And so he invited the musician to come and have a drink with he and his table mates, who also were members of the KKK. The musician was thinking, okay, am I going to get out of this bar alive? But he got to talking with this individual, and they formed a relationship over time, and he convinced this individual to give up his membership of the KKK. And it's been his mission as a one-to-one way of smashing stereotypes, of releasing people from their discriminatory practices. And you always have heard it from me, this idea where people say, I'm just one person, what can I do? But we see throughout history plenty of things you can do, right? Modern racism is quite interesting because it's kind of gone full circle. It became more subtle types of racism, but now over the last 4 years or so, we've gotten very overt racism, where people aren't even afraid to hide their biased opinions based on stereotypes, right? And so through these troubling times, I'm hoping that folks will reach out, even to those friends or family members that you may not agree with, to kind of reach out and find some common ground. Because it's amazing to me, as different as we may be in religious beliefs, politics, sport teams, we have so much more in common, right? So much more in common. I want to tell you about another fella who caused a lot of controversy in the field of social psychology, and his name is Stanley Milgram. Here's a picture of Stanley Milgram, who, as you can see, died very young. This guy had an IQ probably well over 120. He was at one point the president of the American Psychological Association. He lived life to its fullest, and he had an inclination that he was going to die young. He had a feeling. Why? Because heart disease was part of his genetic makeup. His father had died young from a heart attack. So here's young Stanley Milgram, who ironically was about the same age as Kitty Genovese. Here he is in graduate school, and here he is with his shock apparatus machine. Now, I've actually seen this machine in person. It was full of all kind of wires in the back and actually lit up and so forth. So he designs, through his obedience study, this interesting concept. He has an individual who is the experimenter, and then he has another individual who is going to be the subject, who's going to get shocks, and then there's another person who's going to be the teacher, right? So we've got the teacher, the learner, and the experimenter. This is how the setup was basically made. We've got the experimenter who's supervising the experiment. We've got the teacher who's listing a list of words that the learner does not have a copy of the list of words. They have to listen carefully because there's a microphone and speaker available to them. The teacher is instructed to read the list of words, and the learner has to repeat them in the exact same order. If they mess up, even a small error, the learner has to press on this first button right here, which gives them a shock of 15 volts. Every subsequent error, it's increased by 15 volts. So the next one's 30, and then 45, and 60, and 75, and so on and so forth. The machine goes well over to 450 volts of electricity shock. And Milgram was interested in finding out how many people would go all the way to the end. Now, he asked his colleagues, how many people do you think will go all the way to the end and shock people that high? His colleagues said, 1 or 2% at the most. Now, why did Milgram do this study? Growing up in the Jewish faith and traditions, he was always interested in history, like a lot of us are. And he was interested in specifically World War II. Why would German soldiers kill innocent men, women, and children? We see this in every war where non-combatants are killed and slaughtered for no particular reason, right? And the argument that was made, at least by the German soldiers, was they had no choice. They had to obey. Milgram felt like if under the wrong conditions, many of us would do similar things, maybe even hurt people or even harm them to the point of death. So he sets up the obedience study. And so what happens when he records the data? Once he records the data, and by the way, you can watch film clips of this because part of the experiments have been recorded, he immediately found that a significant number of the subjects, approximately 65% of the subjects, shocked all the way to the very end, 450 plus volts. Here we see some of the responses from the learners who are screaming in pain, saying things like, "Get me out of here, get me out of here, I have a heart condition, get me out of here." Screaming in pain, and even high voltage, not even answering anymore. This idea of them being unconscious, and as a teacher, you're shocking a cadaver, right? So he wanted to find out why were these people obeying? Why did they go all the way to the end? As you can see, the actual percentage was 68%. Well, he found out some very specific factors. I've written them up. One important factor was proximity. The fact that the teacher was far away from the learner made a significant difference. It's easier to hurt people you can't see. The fact that the teacher was right next to the experimenter seemed to increase obedience. You get somebody standing over your shoulder, even though they weren't really forcing anybody to do the experiment. The legitimacy of the experimenter seemed to make a difference, right? Person dressed in a lab coat, the legitimacy of where it took place. It took place at a very prestigious university. And so people thought there's no way they would do anything improper. And the fact that there were no role models of defiance, that made a difference. What were the fallout from the experiment? There was talks of suicide. There was talk of mental illness on the result of the teachers who thought legitimately that they had hurt somebody. And it turned out that those issues were false. Nobody committed suicide. Nobody was institutionalized. In fact, the teachers were glad to be part of such a historical experiment. They learned a lot about themselves. But Milgram got in trouble. You can't place human subjects, even though they weren't hurting anybody and they were debriefed afterwards, you can't put them in situations that produce that much stress. And if you ever watch the videos, you'll see that some of them look very stressed while they're pushing the higher voltage and hearing all this feedback. It wasn't until Zimbardo did his famous Stanford prison experiment that the heat was off Milgram. And here's a couple pictures from Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment. As a matter of fact, Philip Zimbardo got a phone call from Stanley Milgram and said, "Thank you for doing the Stanford prison experiment. Now everybody's mad at you and they forgot all about me." Great. Let me give you the answers to the exam. The final review for exam 3, and I know you're going to knock it out of the park for sure. The first question, of course, deals with the case study of Kitty. Be sure to talk about the case study in detail and to list at least 2 of the features I mentioned in the first videotape as to why, what increases our chances of getting help. If you remember, I had a long list of items. Second question deals with Milgram's experimental factors. And I want you to list 2 factors that he found that were relevant in the experiment. That was my handwritten list of items. And the last one I want you to do is to differentiate between a stereotype and discrimination and give some examples, because I know a lot of you have plenty of examples to provide. Okay, so that's it for chapter 12. Looking forward to seeing you for chapter 13, which we're not doing, so I meant 14, of course. So keep that in mind. Do not take notes for chapter 13. And good luck on exam 3. Looking for even better results than exam 2, which were pretty amazing. Take care.